Hello, everybody out there. This is George Gruen at Gruen Guitars for our question and answer session, July 2nd, 2021. And I can at least report that Gruen Guitars is fully open. Tourism and walk-in trade in Nashville is pretty well up to pre-pandemic levels. We are finding that major manufacturers are still back ordered, so it's harder to get prompt delivery from some of the manufacturers, but we ordered heavily before and during the pandemic, so we still have more than most dealers a good selection, especially of Martin guitars. But companies are ramping up production. And unlike the automotive manufacturers who are stuck with lack of chips, that mean that companies like Mercedes and Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors have thousands of cars sitting in lots, unable to ship them out because they don't have the right chips to put in them to finish the job. Most of the guitars we sell don't have any chips in them, and they are coming in at a regular pace for us, but that is again because we ordered well in advance. That sales are strong, and this industry clearly is doing well, with millennials hitting age 40 and having their own midlife crisis, making them want to buy more guitars than ever. The children of millennials from puberty to age 22 also buying guitars, and the younger baby boomers, the older baby boomers are perhaps more selling than buying, or their estates are selling. But since baby boomers are technically from 1946 through 1963, that means that essentially that's a pretty wide range. Somebody born in 63 are not that likely to have the same musical interests as somebody born in 1946. So I think that's an overly broad category. But the younger ones, who are still technically called baby boomers, are still actively buying. So the guitar market's quite healthy. And the manufacturers at this point are also quite healthy. We have a variety of questions. The first one from Jeff Meltzer asks, what are your thoughts on carbon fiber made guitars? Well, there are quite a few makers doing graphite fiber guitars. They are, if properly constructed, remarkably resistant to any changes in temperature and humidity, and structurally can be extremely stable. They vary greatly in sound quality and playability depending on the maker. And of course, the same can be said for wood body guitars. It's just saying, what do wood body guitars have in common? And the answer is they're made out of wood, but there's not much else they may have in common. They may be high quality and they may be mediocre quality. Much the same can be said for graphite, but in general, graphite doesn't sound exactly the same as wood, but it is capable of being made into a guitar that sounds quite decent. And with a pickup can sound remarkably similar to a wood body guitar. If you are a professional performer traveling to and from places that have radically different climate, they are a good option. Also, even if you're not traveling much, but you do indoor gigs and outdoor gigs, the difference between the climate, temperature, and humidity indoors versus outdoors can be very radical. If you're doing an outdoor gig in many areas in the summer, the humidity, if it was high during the day and when it cools at night, is going to have moisture condensing on virtually everything. And I certainly remember going to the Galax, Virginia Music Festival in the second weekend of August, where it's up in what they call the Smoky Mountains, and it ain't wood smoke, it's mist. And it's so humid that instruments can be dripping wet by 1 or 2 in the morning. If they have jam sessions going all night, which they do, most guitars made of wood, if they're fine vintage instruments, are not going to be very happy in that environment. So there are makers such as McPherson that make some graphite guitars that look remarkably similar to their wood body guitars. Color is different, and they make the graphite in a few different weave patterns for the fiber, but the contours of this guitar are very much the same as the McPherson wood body instruments, and the interior bracing pattern is also very much the same. And in fact, on the McPherson wood body guitars, they have composite braces that are wood and graphite composite. So this is a guitar that's actually quite playable, and it does come with a pickup. It's got their typical offset sound hole, which is the trademark of McPherson, but the neck is comfortable and it sounds remarkably like many wood body guitars. I've been told by the folks at McPherson that they have tested these at temperatures as high as 140 degrees Fahrenheit for a week, and things didn't move or degrade, and as low as minus 40 Fahrenheit, which is enough, is also minus 40 Celsius. It's the one point where the two cross. Minus 40 Fahrenheit and minus 40 Celsius are the same. And at any rate, that'd be very, very, very cold, and the other be very, very, very hot. And these can stand any degree of humidity, from absolutely bone dry to dripping wet, and they're not going to go out of adjustment. They're not going to fall apart. Even if you're in a dry climate, things change with temperature. For example, if you've got an outdoor gig and you're in Phoenix, Arizona in the summer, things get really hot. And this guitar won't go out of adjustment. It won't fall apart. It is sturdy. You can travel with it. But it's a guitar that still looks very much like a wood body guitar and sounds pretty much like one. And there are some graphite guitars that don't look much like a wood guitar. Here's a guitar, a Emerald brand made in Northern Ireland. It happens to have a very thin, paper thin veneer of wood, in this case cocobolo, but they offer it in a variety of woods. So it has a peghead veneer and a top veneer of wood, but these veneers are literally just paper thin, and they are structurally not significant, and they are sealed in the resin coating so that they're not going to be subject to changes in humidity. They're not going to warp, twist, whatever. It will not affect the guitar structurally at all. If you look at some of the contours on this guitar, there are contours on this instrument that would be virtually impossible to do in wood. Uh, it is a very interesting guitar because ergonomically it works remarkably well. Uh, it is actually asymmetrical in the way it is sloped here. It's ergonomic, but it's a compound curve that fits the human body remarkably well. But you wouldn't do this in wood. But it is a good sounding guitar. It has a sound I find rather pleasing. It does not have the power of a avant spruce vintage or modern guitar, but it has moderate power, certainly loud enough to play comfortably at home. Would it drive a bluegrass band acoustically? No. Would it work great plugged in? Absolutely. And does it sound loud enough to play at home or in the studio for recording? Absolutely, yes. So then there are times when this is practical. Even great cellist Yo-Yo Ma and great violinist Yitzhak Perlman have endorsed graphite bowed instruments made by Lewis and Clark. And I have had one of those and seen a few others. And I was absolutely amazed at how much the Lewis and Clark violin, which did not look anything like a wood body violin. The contours were quite different. The arching pattern was quite different, but it had no wood other than the bridge and the tailpiece. And it sounded remarkably like a good wood body instrument, had good dynamic range, and had good tone. In fact, it was, in my opinion, the most successful graphite acoustic instrument I've ever heard. It truly had the power and the dynamic range, a lot of the tone, a pretty darn good wood instrument. But if you're playing an outdoor gig, you really want to take a Stradivari violin or a Guarneri violin out there and play it in the sunshine or in the evening. Temperatures and the humidity are rapidly changing. The dew may be settling on it. I don't think so. But the Nashville Symphony plays concerts for the 4th of July coming up this weekend. And they do an outdoor concert. And those symphony players have some fine violins. The concertmaster was Stradivari. But if you think that they want to take that instrument out to the outdoor gig, either daytime or nighttime, the answer is no. So even if you're not traveling from a desert to a rainforest for your gigs, the difference in climate between your air-conditioned home in the summer and outdoors, or for that matter, the climate if you're playing outdoors in October, may be very different from the climate and humidity in your home. And this means that there certainly is a market for graphite guitars and instruments that are very, very stable. So I'll leave it at that. Bill Maxted asks, do I have an opinion on archtop guitars built by Bill Mall, which were played by the late jazz great Bucky Pizzarelli and his son John Pizzarelli? And I think that he made archtop guitars, but what I think is that, in my opinion, the Mall guitars work very well for players who are playing acoustic electric jazz. Virtually everybody I've seen who uses a Mall guitar, especially players like Pizzarelli and Son, who are playing 7-string guitar, they're playing plugged in. I have yet to hear a 7-string acoustic that really had a great sounding low string. But electrically, the low string can amplify extremely well. So with the right pickup, those guitars can be fine. Do I feel that the Mall guitars compete with old Angelico? Not really. But do they have the rhythm sound of an old Stromberg or an old Gibson acoustic jazz guitar designed for orchestral rhythm? The answer is no, but that's not what he was shooting for either. He was shooting for archtop guitars to be played plugged in with a floating pickup and to sound good that way. And for that purpose, his guitars are very good. Do I think they're better than a Angelico or a DeQuisto? No. But do they work really well for their intended purpose? The answer is yes, they do. Do they have the collectability or the monetary value of Monteleone, DeQuisto, or Angelico? No, they don't. But they still are good guitars. And some of his better models did sell in excess of $10,000. And there are jazz players who really do like them. They're not my style guitar personally that I use, but they are good instruments. Scott Major, there's a couple of questions here. One, what are your general recommendations for traveling by air with a guitar, domestically and internationally? Well, for one thing, I really don't like to check guitars as luggage. But if you are going to, I think it's important to have the most indestructible case possible. And that gets down to a few makers such as Calton and Hoffy that make special cases that are graphite shell, very, very sturdy, and they're quite expensive, over $1,000. There are also cases made that are rectangular and are heavy duty, more designed for transport on trucks or buses, but to be really taken on the road and you've got roadies handling them, they're just very heavy and rather awkward, not what most players would want to carry, but if you got roadies to do it for you, they're great. Otherwise, it's great to have a guitar in a gig bag that will fit in the overhead bin. But then you have to be sure that they're going to let you put it up there. Most airlines will accommodate musicians and do have overhead bins that are big enough for a gig bag. But then on short puddle jumper flights, those typically do gate checking. And that also is generally less trouble, less likely that they're throwing your thing around than if it goes over the conveyor belts. So again, for domestic travel, it depends very much, if you're flying, again, I always prefer having it in the overhead bin, but I also don't generally want to take my very, very best guitar to do that. So would I check my floor signed L5 guitar or my 1842 Martin in an air flight that's anything other than in the overhead bin? Absolutely not. Now, internationally, there's a separate question, and that is, used to be basically it was just stayed on the plane longer than if you're flying domestically. But if you're flying from here to Nashville to California, that may be 4.5 hours. If you're flying to London, that's longer. But now we have the question of CITES, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. If you have guitars that have Brazilian rosewood or ivory, you are running a risk. 99% of the time, it may go through with nobody questioning it. But if you do have a problem with a customs official, they can seize the guitar and you may never get it back. So traveling internationally with guitars with Brazilian rosewood or ivory, in my opinion, is not safe. Even if you get the proper permit for transit, that's good for shipping one way, but it doesn't give you a reverse trip. And the regulations, the way CITES is enforced in the US versus the UK is not the same. So you know, the UK requires an import document and they won't accept an export document without having a matching import document, which has to be gotten in advance. The best answer for that is don't take your Brazilian rosewood on international trips. If you want to take a guitar with you, or if you're playing a gig, take one with wood that is not listed on Appendix 1 of the CITES Treaty. And ivory is definitely a no-no for CITES. And even if most of the time you can get through, if you're traveling frequently and you have a guitar that's worth $10,000 or $20,000, you wouldn't want to lose that. And I wouldn't want to take a risk even of 1%, especially if I'm a working musician who's doing 100 gigs a year. That means on average, you might lose a guitar every year. And if it's something that's really valuable that you treasure, don't do that. A separate question from Scott. Would it be possible to automate the construction of an acoustic guitar, including using a CNC, computer numeric control machine, to make the bracing and cursion all made with the top and back together to minimize cost of labor? Basically automate construction of the front and back and simply glue them together. Has this been done? And if so, how did it sound? It hasn't, to the best of my knowledge, been done for a guitar. Now, conceivably, you could take a pretty thick piece of spruce and have a computer program that would grind enough spruce away that you'd have a top and braces in the same pattern as would normally be used, and a bridge plate. But typically a bridge plate is not the same material as the spruce top, so that wouldn't work so well. And the kerf linings also typically are not spruce, so that wouldn't work so well. The top and the braces are both spruce, but if you grind away that much wood, then you're using a piece of spruce that was thick enough to make at least half a dozen tops, and you're grinding it away and wasting 5/6 of the spruce, just as making sawdust. Whereas you can cut the braces and then glue them in. You can put them in a form and just glue them together. And that's not that difficult to do. Plus, the other thing is that if you have the braces with a very slight arch to them, you can glue the spruce and it will have slight tension to it. And this is also a principle on violins. There have been violins made, student models, with the bass bar as an integral part of the top, because on a violin, you're carving the top. So you would not need any thicker piece of spruce to carve it with the bass bar as a part of the top rather than a separate piece. But the bass bar then, while it would look like a bass bar, would not function quite the same, because because it would not be putting any tension on the top. Violin makers do a slight arch to the bass bar such that when it is glued in place, it actually is putting a bit of tension on the top, pushing it a little bit. And the top vibrates differently that way. And as far as the concert players are concerned, it's giving a better sound. So, and the same is true of acoustic guitars. In fact, the Larson brothers of Chicago even advertised in their literature that their guitars, tops and backs, were built under tension. So they actually were made with a bit of an arch, but the top was flat, the back was flat, and then it was glued to bracing that put it into a bit of an arch, but that had a bit of tension on the top and back. And that was done before they were glued in place to the sides and neck block and end block. So that basically is my answer to that particular question. John B., what do you think about vintage Martin bridge pins that were used in their golden age, 1930s, made of Galolith, a caesium resin type of synthetic plastic harder than any modern plastic bridge pins? Guys on the Martin forum have changed over to them and say they hear a more vintage sound and like them better than bone, ivory, ebony, or modern plastics. My own opinion is that with the exception of metal bridge pins that are much, much heavier than any of the plastics, wood or ivory, the sound differences from one type bridge pin to another are very subtle and I don't think are particularly critical. The pre-World War II Martin D18 model and all the style 18s had black bridge pins, were a plastic that was not the same as the so-called Galolith white. So it was similar to an ivoroid look. And the pre-war D18 sound just fine to me. And pre-war style 18 Martin and style 28, 21 Martins had black bridge pins. And they were not this type plastic. And do I hear a big difference based on the bridge pins? The answer is no. Martin currently has so-called liquid metal bridge pins on their new modern deluxe models. These bridge pins are a special alloy that is extremely heavy. These pins must weigh more than 10 times as much as regular bridge pins. And to my ear, I don't like them. Martin's literature says that they give you greater volume and greater sustain. My ears don't tell me that. My ears tell me that if I take those bridge pins out and put in standard regular Martin bridge pins, I like the sound better. So again, there's a good bit of subjective opinion here. But when it comes down to, is there a dramatic change in bridge pins? I would say that it's quite subtle. And if you have a really great guitar, it's going to sound pretty darn great with almost any reasonable weight bridge pin that you put in it. John P. asks, did you ever meet Bill Lawrence? Did you ever get into any pickup design conversations with him? And yes, I knew Bill, because for a good while, Bill was right in Nashville. And I used to see him commonly enough, also at NAMM shows. He built some really fine pickups, especially in his early days. He actually went by the stage name of Willie Laurento when he was living in Germany. He was German. He is now deceased. But at any rate, Lawrence was not his actual real name, but he did go first by Willie Laurento and later by Bill Lawrence. Um, he was a good player, and he did design pickups, which early in his career, he was doing pickups for acoustic guitars as well as electric guitars, but they were magnetic pickups, and they had a fairly distinctive design. But they had a good sounding mid-range and bass as well as treble. I thought they were some of the better sounding pickups in the 70s. He also designed pickups for Gibson for a while, and he then after that went on his own, and the Bill Lawrence Company is still producing pickups, but he himself is gone. The pickups he made later in his life, to my ear, sounded extremely trebly, almost like breaking glass. They didn't have great treble sound, a great bass sound, excuse me. And I actually asked him about that, and he's very firm in his opinion that they sounded just like they used to. And he said, no, he didn't change the sound at all. He says, you're mistaken. They sound exactly like they used to. And watching Bill play, it occurred to me that I think I know the reason why his pickups and also many of Leo Fender's pickups made later in his life sounded very different than their earlier pickups, and to my ear were less pleasant. The earlier pickups by both Fender and by Bill Lawrence had good bass and mid-range as well as fine treble. And the ones they made later in their life sounded brittle, trebly and brittle. And I observed that when Bill played electric guitar, he played plenty loud, and he would be seated directly in front of the amplifier with the amp behind him. And he was sitting right there within 6 feet of an amp, blasting sound out. And I suspect that after you lose almost all of your treble hearing by blowing it out, that you compensate and you build pickups that to your brain process out to having the tone you remember. And hearing is subjective. Hearing is not simply done by the ear. It is a tympanic membrane that vibrates and then transmits through 3 smaller bones, which then go to the cochlea in the ear, which has little hair-like cilia that vibrate, and that transmits nerve impulses to the brain. Well, if any point in that transmission chain is damaged, which they can be by high levels of sound, that the brain does not get the signal to give it the same impression as it had before. So if you lose much of your high-end hearing, in order to get the brain to give an interpretation that was more similar, you add more and more and more treble. And at any rate, that's what I can tell you about Bill Lawrence. He was quite a character, but he was a very fine player. And he had numerous personal theories about electronics, which typically an electronic technician or a physicist would not agree with. But still, he was a surprisingly good technician so far as getting the result, whether his electronic theories made sense or not to a physicist. So far as in practical terms, he could build a pickup that worked. And he was pretty good at selling and promoting his product to potential buyers, both manufacturers and the public. So he was good at what he did. A further question from John P. says, I have the 1987 Les Paul Standard that I bought new. As I learned more and more about guitars over the years, I came to recognize that the neck has more relief on the low E side than on the high E side. The guitar plays well enough for me, but I assume the neck has a twist. I've seen claims that twists can be fixed with heat. Can that work? Or is the 34-year-old guitar neck pretty much set in its ways? And is this kind of twist in some way ideal, as it gives the heaviest strings more room to vibrate? Well, first, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If the feel of the neck is fine for you, it's causing you no problems and it doesn't buzz, the twist isn't hurting you, don't do anything. Use it. If it is causing problems with buzzing or just simply splatting out where you bend the note and it goes dead, then refretting and planing the fingerboard would be the most likely solution, because if it's twisted, a truss rod won't fix that. And there's no good way to heat set a neck to compensate for a twist. That's something to be compensated for with plane and refret. But from what you're describing, it seems to me that it suits you the way it is. So for your purposes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Few more questions that have come in. When did Fender stop using Brazilian rosewood? I heard 1965. This is from Karsten. Was it after NAMM that year? Was it a gradual changeover? In general, the answer is that Fender at least started using Indian rosewood during 1965, and by sometime during 1966, they had pretty well completed the transition. But during the transition, they used both, because rather than throwing away perfectly good Brazilian rosewood, they'd use it up, but they used both for a while. And they did not publicize that in their catalogs. They just said rosewood board. And it could be Brazilian or it could be Indian. Either way, it was a rosewood fingerboard. And the type of rosewood boards they use also changed over the years. So the earliest rosewood boards were thick slab, flat on the bottom, curved on the top. Then later they went to a fairly thick veneer board on the maple neck. And then later yet, they went to a very much thinner rosewood veneer on the neck. And on the really thin veneer, you wouldn't have much room. If you ever did a plane and refret, you'd probably just go right through the veneer. So at any rate, that's the answer to that. Now, his other question is, can Brazilian rosewood be light color or is it always dark? What are its common characteristics? Brazilian rosewood can vary significantly in color, especially heartwood to sapwood. But in general, they're using heartwood. Sapwood is very light colored, and that's not typically what you see on a Fender fingerboard. But it can be with some streaks in the color, but typically it is a more reddish brown, whereas Indian rosewood is a slightly purplish brown. And the grain pattern is such that generally it's a any indentations in the grain pattern tend to be deeper on the Brazilian. And the Brazilian rosewood is a bit more oily and it has a more slippery feel to it than Indian. But both can make a very good fingerboard. And either way, it's not something that is a major structural issue that for most players would not be a major playability issue. But if you want to have the Brazilian rosewood is really pretty stuff. So it's prettier, but again, the grain pattern on Indian varies significantly. And I've seen some beautifully figured Indian rosewood, and either one is good. But as far as when did they do the change, it was over the space of a year. They used up one and went to another. Jeff B had two questions. One says, I've heard that slot heads give a punchier tone than solid headstocks. Have you noticed this? If true, could it be because the angle of the strings across the nut is steeper on the slotted side, so the strings press down into the nut more aggressively, giving a brighter tone? And the answer is yes, it is true that they do give somewhat different sound. Some players don't like the slotted head simply because it's more work to change strings. But the break angle over the nut is quite different. Here is an example of a solid peghead. And as you can see, the string posts stick up over the top. There is an angle back for the peg head, which gives a break angle over the nut. But as you can see, the string posts stick above the surface of the peg head, and the resulting string angle over the nut is quite evident in this view. On a slotted peg head, such as right here, another Martin, quite different, and you can see it's probably going to be more work to change strings on that, but it's not that big a deal. But you can see that the strings are a much steeper break angle over the nut, putting more tension downward on the nut. The angle backward of the peg head is about the same as on the other one, but instead of sticking up over the peg head, those strings are recessed halfway into the peg head. You can see that at this angle. So there is considerably more break angle, and in general, it is my finding that the guitars with a slotted peg head are a bit punchier and also have often more sustain. But it's a sound that I like, but frankly, again, it is somewhat subtle. You can get a good sound with either type peg head. And some of some absolutely marvelous guitars, that some of my favorite guitars, especially all the arch tops that are really good, that they all have solid peg heads. Tuners that have the shaft sticking up. So it's not like all of a sudden all guitars with slotted peg heads sound better than all guitars with solid peg heads, but there is a difference in the sound that's noticeable on the Martin guitars with a slotted peg head versus the ones with a solid peg head. But it is further compounded, though, by the fact that on the 14 fret neck Martin, those typically have a solid peg head. On the 12 fret models, they typically have a slotted peg head, which is traditional for them. But the body is this much longer on a Martin. There's the 14th fret, my finger pointing to, and the body's joining at the 12th fret. But on the 14th fret model, the body is a bit more squared off here. So it's the same body width on the lower bout, but the body on the 12th fret Martin is longer. The position of the sound hole with respect to the length of the body is different. So and the position of the bridge with respect to the total length of the guitar is also different, therefore. So you're changing actually several variables. So it still gets down to the combination of variables results in a guitar that I like the sound of the 12th fret Martins, but I'd still have to tell you that some fabulous Martins have 14th fret necks and a solid peg head and the shorter body. So you can build a very, very fine guitar both ways, but there is a subtle difference in tone. This one back. He asks another question from Jeff B. Who do you consider to be the inventor of the modern solid body guitar, George Beecham or Les Paul? My answer is absolutely neither one. George Beecham designed the first magnetic guitar pickup, which was a very good design, the horseshoe magnet design that was used by Rickenbacker. He patented it, and it was a very good sounding pickup, but that horseshoe magnet was physically sort of in your way on a standard style guitar. They were fine on lap steels, but still that really led the way toward the future of electric guitars, because while others may not have used his exact design, it certainly introduced the concept of a magnetic pickup rather than a crystal pickup, and that was a very critical factor. But I haven't seen any modern style solid body guitars that Beecham designed. The earliest Rickenbacker guitar was the electro frying pan lap steel, and those had a aluminum cast neck and body. They were hollow construction simply to save weight because they would be awfully heavy otherwise, but that would not be a solid body modern guitar. Les Paul, I do not feel deserves the credit for being maker of the first solid body modern style guitar. The Les Paul was designed by Ted McCarty and crew, team, and they took a sample to Les and he agreed to endorse it. And he made a few suggestions like the color with the gold top and that trapeze bridge tailpiece combination that stayed for only about 1 year and got dumped. But also Les suggested so-called fretless wonder frets on Les Paul Custom that very few people like today. But there were solid body electric guitars in the 1939 Slingerland catalog. They were solid body round neck guitars, not lap steels. And there are photos showing Les Paul holding a Rickenbacker Bakelite guitar. That model came out in 1936 with the so-called Spanish neck. It was not a lap steel. It was a round neck electric guitar with a body that functioned as a solid body. It had a few holes in it simply to reduce weight, but the Bakelite plastic body was quite heavy and had basically no acoustic properties. It was a guitar that was purely functioning as a solid body type electric. There are folks who consider Paul Bigsby to be the inventor of the solid body, but he made guitars that looked like solid body guitars, but they weren't. He made guitars that looked remarkably modern. They had peg heads quite similar to a Fender with 6 strings on his side. He did that before Leo Fender did. There are folks who claim that they think Leo stole the design. Well, there are similarities enough that I can say that when Leo made the Telecaster, the Peghead shape was really not that much like a Bigsby, but the Stratocaster, and particularly the Jazzmaster and Jaguar Pegheads, look very, very much like a Bigsby, but those weren't introduced until much later than the Broadcaster, which was the first commercially successful solid body electric. But AudioVox in Seattle was making solid body electric guitars and solid body electric fretted basses as early as 1936, and also made amplifiers. So this certainly predates Les Paul. Even the Fender Broadcaster, which came out in 1950, predates the Les Paul solid body Gibson guitar. But Les, in his experiments like 1940, produced the so-called log, which had a solid middle segment, but it had hollow wings that were very crudely stuck on. And Les didn't make the neck. He didn't make the wings. That was from another guitar. He just sawed those parts off and he made this plank for the middle. And he wound his own pickups. But the point is, Les really didn't design the solid body electric guitar. He didn't come up with the concept of the electric solid body. It was already there. And he didn't truly design the Les Paul guitar as much as he endorsed it and got a royalty on it and had made a few suggestions. But most of the guitars he played, the Les Paul models, were highly modified. He would hot rod them considerably. But questions? Newly arrived that I have not yet seen or read, but let's just go through it. Todd Johnston, Johnston, always love these. George, can you rate the substitute woods for Brazilian rosewood to the best of your knowledge? Well, Indian rosewood, which has been very widely used by many makers, including Martin, is actually a very good substitute for Brazilian rosewood. In the 1930s, Herman Hauser, who made guitars for Segovia and numerous other players, used Indian and Brazilian and charged the same for either one. You get your choice, but Indian rosewood cost just as much in the 1930s as Brazilian rosewood did. But Brazil put an embargo on rosewood logs in the late 1960s, and Martin switched to Indian rosewood because they were unwilling to buy wood cut in Brazilian sawmills because the Brazilian sawmills wouldn't cut it the way Martin wanted. They would slab cut it or turn it into veneer, but they wouldn't season it properly and it would crack and warp and would be unsuitable. So Martin felt that it was best to find something new, and they used Indian rosewood. Now today you can get custom guitars with Madagascar rosewood, which looks a whole lot like Brazilian, but really doesn't sound like it. And you can get Guatemalan rosewood, Cocobolo, Honduran rosewood, Pau Ferro. There are numerous species in the genus Delbergia, as well as some other similar woods that work remarkably well. But I think that so far as a good substitute, it happens that Indian rosewood, I think, is highly underrated. And on the custom guitars that we have made for us now, I can say that it's our experience that Indian rosewood seems to work fully as well as Madagascar, Honduran, or Cocobolo. Those are all good woods, and you can make a good guitar out of any of them. But the fact is, Do I think that there are other alternative woods that you can use in place of Brazilian that sound especially better than Indian rosewood as a substitute? So far, not especially. I've seen also some Indian rosewood that has magnificent, beautiful grain lot figure. Uh, Most of it doesn't. Most of it's very straight grained, but there are some really magnificently figured pieces. But beautifully figured wood does not necessarily happen to sound any better, and sometimes is structurally not quite as stable. But players do like pretty, and they will pay extra for it. But when it comes right down to it, Indian rosewood is good stuff. We are using it on the custom guitars that we order from Martin. And we have in the past had some with Guatemalan, Honduran, Cocobolo, and Madagascar rosewood, all of which sounded quite good. But I think that when it comes right down to it, none of them were really any better sounding to my ear than Indian rosewood, which is more readily available. So, but Brazilian rosewood is great stuff. But today, most of the Brazilian rosewood available is stuff that was cut quite a long while ago. It's often structurally not all that stable. It's been picked over so that it's sort of the leftovers, because Brazilian rosewood was put on Appendix 1 of the CITES Treaty, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, June 11th of 1992. So wood that's been sitting around since then may not be the very best. And high quality Indian rosewood, in my opinion, is better than leftover, lower quality Brazilian. If you can find really high quality Brazilian, more power to you, use it. But just make sure it has the proper documentation that it's legal. Because you wouldn't want to have them confiscate your guitar. Richard C. says, you've discussed the value of guitars being higher because they've been owned by celebrities or because of brand name. Would you say that this applies to Gruen Anniversary Martins, or would they fetch the same price based on the quality of materials without your name on them? They're beautiful instruments, but do you believe your signature rightfully adds to the value? I think it would be nice if someday people thought that it was worth more because my name was on it and I signed the labels, but when it comes right down to it, we haven't priced them that way. We priced them the same as if they were made by Martin to these specs without my name associated with them. Now that my name is associated with them because I did a good bit of designing for them, I specified what I wanted, and we did put labels in them that were signed by me. But do I price them higher because my signature is in there? No. We have exactly the same markup on those as other guitars we get from Martin that are standard models that don't have my name on them. They are expensive because they have expensive specs. They are well-figured sinker and the highest possible grade that Martin has of spruce. They have fancy abalone trim on the top. They have abalone CF Martin logo plus a deluxe style 45 torch on the peg head. They have the style 45 snowflake fingerboard inlay. So they're expensive for that reason. Do I want to speculate about how much my name will add to the value 40 or 50 years from now? Not really. But I do know that I'll be 76, August 26th, and I'm probably not going to be around 40 years from now to discuss this with people. But On the other hand, my great uncle Otto lived to be 105, so I'd like to stick around a while. I'm having too much fun to want to retire, but I don't place a great deal of extra importance for the name of a dealer on a guitar. Yes, they're limited editions, but again, they're just good guitars and they're priced accordingly. Um, Michael O'Neill says, I have roughly 27 instruments, mandolins, acoustic and electric guitars. I'm considering selling some of them. Are there any organizational tips and or recommendations you have for selling, consignment value proposition versus selling myself, etc.? Thanks. I'll start by saying I am a dealer. I do handle a lot of consignments as well as buy outright and trade. And when giving investment advice, you should be aware that I may have a psychological bias to thinking that people should do business with me or some other dealer rather than going on their own. But I think that I can actually justify it. We have better connections for selling than most people would have. And the consignment commission is not especially any more than if you were going through some of the web services where you can list a guitar on your own. But when we handle a guitar, we examine it with meticulous care. We are ready to put in writing certification of what it is so a potential buyer knows that if we are representing it, our reputation goes with it. We would send on approval and we would provide written documentation as to what it is. And we would see to it that the guitar is set up in proper playing order. And if there are any defects, they are disclosed. You can buy with confidence. Typically, as a result, we can get 25% or more over and above what a private buyer would be likely to get. And we're likely to sell it quicker. But we also are going to do the legwork needed to get it set up in good playing order and to represent it properly. We have a large want file. Who wants what? We call people if we have something they want. We list it on our website, which goes out to be seen by many, many people. We have a mailing list that receives the printouts anytime there's a new description list of new arrivals that goes to several thousand people. It's presented on social media as well as the website. We have a showroom that is visited by hundreds of people per day. We put something of value, our knowledge, our experience, our connections, and careful representation of an instrument. So if you can sell it on your own for more than us, more power to you. But frankly, if the average seller could sell it for as much as I can after I've had the experience collecting guitars since 1963 and being the CEO of Gruen Guitars for 51.5 years since January of 1970, then I should probably quit because all of the experience, connections, staff, knowledge that they have, if that and our talents don't bring anything to the table, then we're just not doing our job. And I feel that we are doing our job. So I think that consignment will get you more money then you'll be likely to get on your own, and consignment will certainly get you more money than we or other dealers would pay as an outright purchase. Although in trades, if you're looking for something else and just want to trade one for another, you can come out fully as well trading as if you were to consign an instrument. But a reputable dealer, me or others, and we don't claim to be the only reputable dealer on planet Earth, can work with you. If you're dealing with a dealer with knowledge and integrity, and they're bringing all their connections to bear, they can do more than you can on your own. We work hard to earn that commission that we get, and the goal is to get you more than you would have achieved had you tried to sell it yourself. Dave Truly says, are you familiar with a luthier named Trotman who lived in New Orleans? I assume he is dead now, but he rebuilt an old Martin for me years ago. Unfortunately for that one, I knew of a guy in Birmingham by that name, but Troutman, not familiar with him. So that one, I really can't give you a good answer, because when I don't know, I openly admit I don't know. Richard Craig. Let's see, now that's the one that just, that's a repeat of a previous question. Dr. Michael Callie. George, is there a great go-to reference for the collector to utilize with regard to a constantly updated value of vintage guitars and other stringed fretted instruments like the Blue Book for automobiles? And one is the Vintage Guitar Magazine Price Guide, which if you buy it, also comes with a service that is online with a special code. If you buy their book, you get a code where it puts you into their private website that is constantly updated with prices that may be in some ways similar to the Blue Book for automobiles. Another is Reverb, has lots of listings and also does have listings of the prices that previous instruments have brought. Is that the same level of knowledge that an appraisal from a knowledgeable appraiser, me and Joe Spann on my staff included, is it equivalent? The answer, in my opinion, is no. The Blue Books and Reverb are reasonably good on relatively common items. And the rarer something is, the less valid their figures tend to be. And on some items, I just vehemently disagree with them, to the point where I would be delighted to be able to buy some old Epiphone archtops made before Epiphone was acquired by CMI, Chicago Musical Instrument Company, which owned Gibson and bought Epiphone in '57. But the old original Epiphone archtops and many of the Epiphone flat tops are very good. And Epiphones and many of the Guild guitars are valued very significantly less in the Vintage Guitar Magazine Guide than I think they're worth. And I think that's strongly enough that I'm quite happy to put money where mouth is and buy them for more money than the top dollar retail values listed in the Vintage Guitar Magazine Price Guide on many of those models. And there are also some flat top models, some of the more obscure ones by Gibson and others, that I feel are undervalued in the book. They claim that the values are based on sale prices that are provided to them by a panel of dealers. But the fact is that I see some models in there that I know darn well those dealers haven't seen. And when they get down to things like how much is a lower signed L5 Gibson worth, well, there were fewer than 40 of them ever made. And I'm quite willing to buy some of those for every bit as much as the book says that their top dollar retail would be. But the more rare the item is, the less likely the book is to be really accurate. And they also have a tendency to lump things into categories that just don't make sense to me. With Stratocasters, the Vintage Guitar Magazine price guide has multiple pages, at least 7 or 8 pages of listings just on various different year, different color, different spec Stratocasters. But they take something like Martin D28 and they'll lump things together in categories that don't make any sense to me. And take a category like 1944 through 1949 and put it all together as one, which they're not. They changed specs considerably. And for Martin, his differences were 1944 Martin guitar would have scalloped bracing, and if it's a style 28, it would be herringbone trim. It would have slotted diamond-shaped fingerboard inlays, and it would be a quite fine guitar with an Adirondack spruce top. But by late 44, the same model had dot inlays and non-scalloped bracing, but still had an Adirondack top. But that's not as good a guitar. That should be a separate category. But then that spec continues through 1945. But in 46, they still had herringbone trim, but they now have a Sitka spruce top with non-scallop bracing. And that is a very different sounding guitar. In my opinion, should be less valuable. But after the first work order batch in 47, they discontinued the herringbone trim. But the point is, specs kept changing, and sometimes things get lumped together in these guides too broad a category where they'll have meticulously close categories, lots and lots of categories, so page after page of every change in a Strat, but nowhere near the meticulous cover of the Martin. And certainly not the great coverage on old Epiphones. So, again, be careful. But we do have an appraisal service, and I'm also very easy to reach by phone. You can call me at the shop number 615-256-2033, or you can email me, george@guitars.com. I'm happy to answer questions. That doesn't mean I'm going to do free appraisals, but I'll discuss general trends, and I'm happy to talk to people. And we certainly are happy to do appraisals. We have an online appraisal service as well as in-person appraisal service. And they are not fully equivalent. The online appraisal has a disclaimer. There's a limit to what we can see in photos, but we're pretty darn good. If you give us good photos, we see a lot. But we can't see something like a loose brace in a photo. We can't tell if the truss rod works in a photo. We sure can when we get it in person. So the in-person inspection is more in-depth, and we charge a bit more for it. But we do offer that service, and I am available email and phone for general questions and even some very specific questions. I'm not going to do appraisals of exact price online of your guitar. But so far as market trends and virtually any question about identifying one model versus another, that's all free info. I'm easy to reach, and I'm happy to talk to people with interesting, intelligent questions. So please contact me. Until then, see you next week. Have a good one.